Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the chance to speak here. I have a paper that is far too long to be delivered in 30 minutes, so what I want to do is to focus on some of the main arguments of the paper. Perhaps some of you have already looked at it or will have chance to look at it later, so I will only present the skeleton of the argument. The paper deals with one particular group of excluded people, refugees. We all know that the refugee crisis has become one of the major political problems in Europe in the last 2 years, and it is structured into 3 chapters. The first are general moral reflections. The second deal with legal principle and the question what good law should be. This means, in my language, natural law principles. And finally, with problems of political expediency, obviously triggered by the German situation, since I myself am a German citizen. I begin my essay with quoting a famous essay by Peter Singer in his influential book, Practical Ethics. I should say it's interesting that the chapter on refugees is found only in one of the 3 editions of Practical Ethics, not in the first edition, because he thought the problem was too thorny. Then he put it in the 2nd edition, and then he took it out in the 3rd edition because he could no longer agree with what he had written. And this shows the problem is objectively one of the most difficult problems of political ethics. In this chapter, in the 2nd edition, Singer uses very simplifyingly the following argument. If we would live in a fallout shelter after a nuclear strike, which was built for 10,000 people, but could house additional 10,000 people with considerable constrictions on our way of life, but so that none of us would starve, would it be more moral to accept 0 people into it, 500 or 10,000? And his answer is, based on his ethical principles that are those of utilitarianism, that of course we should take in 10,000 people, and he tries to generalize the argument for the question how many refugees should be accepted. My own meta-ethical stance is quite different from Singer's utilitarianism. I defend a material value ethics centered on the concept of person on the basis of a principle of universal visibility. And my 2 great heroes in ethics, in my own book, Morals and Politics, are Immanuel Kant and Max Scheler. But I do share the concrete starting point of Singer concerning both this and other issues, that it's morally wrong to satisfy luxury needs when, with some limitations of one's consumption, human lives can be saved. If the prohibition on killing humans rests on the value of human life, this value must also justify the moral command to save human lives whenever possible. Still, and here I come back to Partha's point this morning, there is little doubt that there are crucial differences between actions and omissions, and within omissions, between omissions of a concrete duty that one owes due to one's own earlier behavior and omissions of generic duties. For while the idea has to be condemned that helping starving people is supererogatory, it is true that even helping the poorest is subordinated in urgency to other acts. First, we have to pay our debts before we can begin to think about being generous. For concrete obligations toward our creditors are more urgent. This includes, for example, also obligations toward our parents, since we owe our existence to them. Similarly, if we have caused a damage, we have first to pay compensation for it before we can begin to think about other duties. And even if children are, of course, not damages, we are responsible for their existence, and therefore we have far-reaching responsibilities toward about duties. We have also preferential duties concerning people to whom we are bound by promises. Interesting question is whether fellow citizens enjoy a preferred status. I will come back later to this issue. While a prohibition on actions do not kill can easily be satisfied by refraining from actions of killing, a prohibition on generic omissions, do not omit to help humans in dire need, is much more difficult to implement. If it means help all indigent people, nobody can satisfy it, and if it means help as many people as possible, as in the impressive papal document that we received, the question, of course, means what do you mean by impossible in the short term or in the long term? For example, if you have to decide about your surplus income, do you give it to the poor or do you invest it? It's not obvious that giving it to the poor is the only moral solution, because by investing you may be able to produce far more income that then can be shared with more poor people. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would never have been able to do what it does if Bill had not invested his money in order to become richer. What are the criteria that we should use when we select the recipients of our charitable activities? I see 3 criteria. The one obviously is that you help those who are more desperately in need, for example, whose life is in danger. I connect this to Rawls' difference principle, even if the extension to it of international order transcends Rawls' intention. The second principle is that one should help those who, by the help afforded, will be rendered able to help themselves. These people only rarely, sometimes but only rarely, coincide with the first group, but it's reasonable to help them for various reasons. The one is that you can achieve more people because then people will get out of the need of being helped furthermore and then be motivated to help other people. Furthermore, to achieve autonomy is in itself a good. An important point, and the third criterion is simply that those who are not responsible for the needs in which they are deserve more help than those that are responsible. This principle can be justified both on a Kantian point of view, but also on a consequential point of view, because it deters people from acting irresponsibly if they know that they will be not be up on the priority list. Obviously, our capacity to help is limited, and therefore we have to use criteria of rational allocation in order to answer this question. I try to refute the argument that charity has nothing to do with economic rationality. We have to do always with economic rationality whenever we deal with scarce commodity, and unfortunately our resources that we can employ for charitable purposes are scarce. Now, after these general principles, I deal with the question, how do these principles apply to the specific problem of helping refugees? And I think that many of them are plausible candidates for help. They flee from terrible hardships and even life-threatening situations. Otherwise, they would not engage in the very dangerous journeys that they engage in. Only in few cases can the suspicion arise that they are responsible for their plight. Regarding the other 2 criteria, the issue becomes more complex. Let's look at the first criterion. Many of the people left behind in a war-torn country are usually worse off, for they could not afford the flight. Without a military intervention, which is rarely advisable, there are limited possibilities to help them. So unfortunately, some of the victims are not real competitors. Yet compared to the Syrians who managed to get to Germany, not only those Syrians who could not escape from the country, but also those Syrians who could cross the border to the neighboring countries, but did not make it to a camp of the UN Refugee Agency, and even the one who live in the scandalously underfunded camps are considerably worse off than those who have arrived in Western Europe. On purely moral grounds, it's not immediately clear why the latter are more entitled to help than other groups. And certainly we should not allow the increase in help for refugees to put down our developmental aid, which has happened in several countries after the refugee crisis. Psychologically, it is, of course, true that we find ourselves more bound to help the person who knocks at our gates and whose face we have seen than people who are far away, anonymous, and invisible to us. But as a Kantian, I must insist that it is not evident to me that following moral instincts instead of general principle is the best solution. If one can save more human lives by investing in refugee camps than by hosting refugees in one's own country, it could be well morally legitimate to do so. Second, concerning the issue of achieving the capacity to help oneself, an indiscriminate admission of refugees is also not the best strategy, because if we want to have people who will be soon able to help themselves, to look at qualities like integrability in the society that accepts them is a reasonable criterion. Well, people will say, but this is only in the interest of the country that accepts them. Maybe, but I make the point that in the long term we'll be able to convince more people to do good if some form of mutuality comes out at the end. I'm a strong insistent on the idea that moral duties are irreducible to rational interest. I do even think that those philosophers who think that moral obligations are nothing else than serving the self-enlightened interest are philosophical reprobates. They deny the basic principle of morality, but in the long term it is clearly important in order to achieve more, to have some form of connection. And there is furthermore to say that by having very vague criteria about which people will be accepted, we in fact instigate the risky behavior of human trafficking, and even if the people don't die on their journey, when they are repatriated, all the resources that they've invested in this journey for nothing are lost to the development of their own country. So it is very reasonable that countries have clear criteria that make obvious which people will be accepted instead of leaving it completely vague what will be successful. I've spoken about the moral duties that we have toward people unable to help themselves, among whom refugees are a particularly relevant class. Because they are no longer protected by their own state, sometimes they're even persecuted by their own state. In some cases, they're even stateless. At the same time, of course, we know that almost all states of the world control the borders and do not allow entrance for everyone who seeks it. Why is it so? Well, there are various reasons why states do it. The one is, of course, that not every country could house all refugees. If all people who would fly from a huge country would come to Luxembourg, they simply wouldn't physically fit in. Second, even if they fit in, it would be very difficult to house them, to feed them, to give schooling to their children. And paradoxically, the better the welfare state is, usually the more difficult it is to do it because it's more expensive. In some cases, one can even have a justified fear that an influx of people from very different cultures could endanger the local community's cultural capital, which alone made it economically so successful. I do not say that this fear is always justified, but it's a widespread fear, and it's not completely absurd. If people say, well, if we bring in people who have not internalized the principle of a modern rule of law, of a certain work ethics, then our country will no longer be able to maintain, for example, its social security. There is still a more important and more subtle level. Simply developing a list of what is morally desirable is unsatisfying. We want it to achieve social reality. The idea of natural law is exactly this. It demands that certain norms be enforced, for example, the threat of punishing the violators. But the enforcement of certain norms is possible only if there are subjects that recognize the duties correlated to the rights that should be enforced. A state is exactly this. It is an organization of people on a given territory with the task of maintaining a certain legal order, which encompasses also the norms dealing with the organization of a state. In extreme case, this task may involve the sacrifice of one's own life. The pride that people take in belonging to a state is justified. Without the state, the Hegelian point, the moral norms would remain mere wishes. Within the state, they can achieve a status of a lived reality, the social issues that Russell was just developing so convincingly, shared by the members of a community who trust that most members of a state accept the common legal norms, who therefore can plan their lives with much greater ease. The cultural cohesion and the social architecture without which a state cannot operate are not something that goes without saying. Look at the frequency of civil wars. I don't know if the data is still actual, but some years ago I looked up and a quarter of all wars that have been waged in human history are civil wars, as wars within states, because it doesn't go without saying that people will live peacefully together. It becomes even more difficult if a country is democratic, because a democracy presupposes a greater cultural cohesion than non-democratic states, because people have to come together not only to live peacefully, but to agree on the legislative process. Paradoxically, the multicultural empires were often more open to diversity than democratic states. Michael Walzer has compared the refugee issue to clubs. He says the immigration and emigration are morally asymmetrical. Everybody must have a right to emigrate from a state, but this cannot mean that every state has a duty to accept anyone who wants to immigrate. That is his central point. But although the rights of humans can only be protected in states that cannot open their borders indiscriminately, this does not mean that from a moral point of view, humans have their rights only thanks to the power of the states. Here we have to distinguish between the social question and the moral justificatory question. The moral justificatory question is that as humans we have certain basic rights, but as members of different political communities, which based on different cultures and histories have different ways of organizing our legal systems, we inevitably will treat some humans, the citizens of that community, unlike the others. This does not mean that the outsiders are without rights or without a moral and religious recognition of their claims. And one of the great events in 20th century international law was the legal recognition of a refugee's right. I very quickly touch the history. I speak of Plato, who insists that only after agreements and promises have been made, the rights of xenoi foreigners and suppliants, come close to our refugees, the Hiketai, are very, very important, even if there were no legal mechanisms in the Attic polis to protect them. But there are terrible religious sanctions on those who inflict their claim. I then discuss the fact that in Greek tragedy, quite a lot of them deal with the problems of refugees. It's one of the major problems of Greek tragedy. We have 2 tragedies of the 31 preserved with the titles to Plines. And then I discuss, Anna Marta did it yesterday, Kant's contribution to the development of a Weltbürgerrecht, cosmopolitan law, which somehow prepares idea of refugees law. It is tempting to see in Kant's chapter one of the seeds of the development of universal human rights, which is certainly one of the greatest innovations of international law in the 20th century. After the atrocities of 2 world wars, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 48, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, both of 66, have been the most general expressions of recognition of basic human rights by international positive law. The declaration, of course, is not legally binding, but one can say that it has probably assumed the status of customary international law. In a splendid work on the rights of refugees, James Hathaway, professor at University of Michigan, has analyzed very well the development of the rights of foreigners under international law. He thinks that there are 3 steps. First, there was aliens law, which put limits to the right of states to treat persons within their jurisdiction in the manner they like, but was only supervised on a bilateral level. Second, we have a League of Nations system for protection of national minorities after the First World War. And finally, we have the international refugee rights regime. After the radical transformation of the political landscape at the end of the First World War, the world was confronted with millions of people who were at the mercy of a foreign state and could no longer appeal to diplomatic protection of their own state. And I want to mention that one of the great heroes of the 20th century, since we have 2 half Norwegian colleagues, for me is Fridtjof Nansen, who was the founder the High Commissioner for Refugees, who deserved the Nobel Prize for it, and in fact, in 1938, the Nansen International Office received then the prize too, and the UNHCR received the Nobel Prize for Peace twice, because they do a very, very important and indispensable work. 3 points are very crucial. The legal issues are quite complex, and there are far, far more competent persons in this room than I am, but let me sum up a few points that I regard as important. The status of refugees is granted only to people who, being outside the country of their nationality, or in the case of stateless people, the country of their former habitual residence, are unable or unwilling to return, quote, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Note, this does not include everyone whose life is in danger, such as potential victims of wars or even of many civil wars. That is the reason why the European Directive 2004/83 EC grants the so-called subsidiary protection, for example, to people who face serious and individual threat to their life and person by indiscriminate violence in situations of international or internal armed conflicts. Article 15C. Since the Convention represented a remarkable progress, it would be unfair to criticize its definition of refugee. But from a moral point of view, it is not immediately clear what distinguishes the lethal danger facing a child based on its race from that based on indiscriminate violence in a war. The poor Syrian children who were blown up in the bus that brought them out of a city that had been under siege, obviously are as deserving of compassion as people who will be killed because of their race. Obviously, the convention was an attempt to find a compromise between the right of states to control access to the territories and the recognition of the duty to help some people in dire need. Second, the Convention of 51, building on the one of 1933, but extending it considerably, granted substantial rights to refugees, besides the formal right to non-discrimination based on race, religion, or country. They are not to be penalized for seeking protection, even if by means of illegal entry from the country where they are persecuted. They cannot be expelled without strong reasons, once lawful in the country, and under no circumstances may they be sent back to the frontiers of the territories where their life and freedom would be threatened on the grounds that define a refugee, as long as they have not been convicted in a final judgment of a particularly serious crime. There are not only rights to freedom from interference, parta, but also explicitly rights to positive benefits and to procedure, such as to housing, public education, public relief, or administrative assistance for those lawfully staying. The rights that are granted to refugees are ordered in three groups. There are rights to the people who are only physically present, those who are lawfully present, and those who are lawfully staying. But even the least protected group has basic rights to positive benefits due to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Third, the Convention, while specifying the rights of refugees, does not oblige any state to accept refugees. That is something that persons who are not trained in these matters often do not understand correctly. This is one of the reasons why it found so many signatories, paradoxically. Once they have crossed the border, even illegally, the refugees have important rights. But this does not entail that states have a legal duty to open their borders to let them in, and even less to help the refugees to reach them. This is exactly what most states do. They bar access either physically or legally by requiring visa from certain states, by declaring entire populations as not at risk, and even by creatively obviously, cynically, interpreting parts of their territories as being outside their own territory in order to avoid the legal consequences attached to the entry of their territory. Sometimes part of an airport are declared international zones, and Australia in 2001 excised several islands from the migration zone so that people landing there could not apply for visas. Since they were not very successful, in 2013, Australia declared the whole mainland excised. I find it scandalous, violation of what the clear meaning of a convention is. The United States have not gone so far, but they have, for example, declared that refugees found in American waters can be sent back, even if nothing in the conventions limits the territory of the state to land and not to water. Also, for me, this is a clear violation of the treaties. But I give in a very tragic story, the humorous comparison of a movie, Buster Keaton's Our Hospitality, one of my favorite movies of Buster Keaton. The story is the following. Buster Keaton comes back to a town where his family come from. He doesn't understand that his family had to flee because they were involved in a family feud, and by chance, he enters the house of the people who had lost some members in the vendetta between the two families, but he's guest, and they find out who he is. So they try to invite him to get out of the house, because as soon as he's out of the house, they want to shoot him and to kill him. And he decides to stay longer in the house because he understands it's a little bit dangerous to leave that house. And the contrast between the kindness while he's a guest, southern hospitality, is after all important gentleman duty, and the desire to get rid of him in order to be able to kill him is the whole tension on which the movie lives. It's of course solved how sometimes these refugee conflicts can be solved, but the girl falls in love with him, and when they marry, he's part of the family, and the feud is over. That is the way how you solve this conflict. The recognition of moral duties towards people who one at the same time tries to prevent, by all means, from getting into a situation in which they get legal rights corresponding to these duties is hardly convincing. However, I repeat that no country could check billions of people claiming refugee status, and it's particularly clear that refugees cannot have the right to choose their homestead. Otherwise, everybody would come to Norway or to Germany. Asylum shopping that would demand administrative resources that cannot be delivered to more needy persons. One can also argue that the first country of arrival is usually, even if not always, culturally closer to the country of origin, so that integration is less demanding. And yet it's clear that the first country of arrival rule disadvantages the poorest countries. For the current historical situation, they are most likely to be neighbors of countries from which refugees flee. In the UNHCR mid-year Trans-June 15 reports, I read that 10 countries that have hosted most refugees, 57 of them under UNHCR mandate, were in the following order: Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, Jordan, Kenya, Uganda, Chad, and Sudan, only Turkey being an OECD country. If you look at the number of refugees per 1,000 inhabitants, the OECD countries Only Sweden and Turkey belong to the 10 countries on the top of the list in June 2015, before the influx into Germany, with 15 and 24 compared to the 209 people per 1,000 inhabitants in Lebanon. All this cannot be called fair, obviously not, no more than the Dublin III regulation within the European Union, which put the burden of refugees only on the southern members, Spain, Malta, Italy, Greece, and to a lesser degree Hungary. That the EU omitted to help the neighboring countries of Syria before the physical momentum of the refugees toward Europe obliged it to act contributed to the mass exodus and was not a sign of provident and moral politics. What can a fair solution be? Well, it's difficult. I think that there are relevant moral criteria, like non-relational criteria, size of the country, lower density of population, GDP. Then there is the relational criterion of integrability of refugees into a specific country. But it is clear that we must find a form of global sharing of the expenses. Even the states that do not let people in have to pay for a time of those countries that house them for a time of transition. I insist on the fact that it's reasonable to have some form of agreement, like an insurance system, so that countries that are willing to help refugees would then be preferentially treated in the case they themselves bring forth refugees. And I also insist that there are certain cases of refugees where the duty to take them in is not, how should I say, discretionary based on other possible alternatives, namely when we have a responsibility for the flight. Obviously, the United States, with the crazy invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was against international law, was absolutely immoral and was absolutely imprudent, has assumed of responsibility for the people of this country. Forgive me, also the United Kingdom, for cooperating in this war, and therefore they have a moral duty to take people in. And the other aspect would be the climate. Refugees, which will become more and more important. Unfortunately, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts, paragraph 52 of draft decision CP21, explicitly states that Article 8 of the agreement does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. This is scandalous, but this is the legal state. Let me finish, since I have only 3 minutes, with some reflections on what happened in Germany in 2015. In the whole, I think that Chancellor Merkel proved to be a very moral person. I understood her as acting as the daughter of a Lutheran minister, like, and here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. He did it out mainly on moral grounds. Perhaps she wanted to secure a place in history. Some people have reflected about it. But look, the abyss of the human heart is such, I don't know my heart. I don't like to engage in scrutinizing the hearts of other people and to find out what is egoistic, what is non-egoistic. In the whole thing, it was a remarkable decision. Still, I think that there were several errors, and I want to mention them because they explain the reactions in Germany. I do think that an important motive for her, based on her speeches, was to overcome the xenophobia of many Germans and to make the country more open to the world. I completely agree that this is a very important aim. In fact, already in 1997, I called it depressing that Germany still has not reached consensus about an adequate immigration law. But unfortunately, 20 years later, we are, despite some limited progress, in the same depressing predicament. We have no immigration law in Germany. And I do think it would have been wiser first to work for such a law and to do within such law a broad place for refugee protection, like the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Of course, I speak as an armchair philosopher who is not in the situation of politicians who has to make decisions under pressure. But what I've already alluded to, I regard as one of the major problems of our own political system, for which we'll pay a very, very high price, that politics is, partly due to the media system, more and more reactive. You react only when the water comes to your neck. A good politician has to plan in advance what are the problems that will come to us in the next 20 years and try to develop strategies for doing them. And so the fact that we made this decision without the context of an Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, I think, was not good. Second, the government should have informed the population about the concrete content, the extent, and the duration of its measures and the moral reasons for its decisions. several things that Chancellor Merkel said were legally not correct. And she said, for example, because of the conventions, we are obliged to take them in, which I just said is not true. And everybody could look it up in Wikipedia and find out that Chancellor Merkel was not telling the truth. Because once we're in, of course, we enjoy protection, but this doesn't mean that the opening of the borders was necessitated by the convention. She was not clear about all it. I repeat that I admire her decisions, but the widespread phobia of moral pathos in postmodern societies, the Chancellor's lack of oratory skills, and the decreasing capacity of the German public to listen to remarks longer than the usual talk show contribution were causes for the lack of a grand speech to the nation, which she should have done. A worrisome aspect of the decision of the government was, in my eyes, that no parliamentary authorization was looked for. It's a very complex constitutional issue whether she was bound to do so. I'm not an expert in German constitutional law, but I know a little bit about it, and I think that the arguments that several important German constitutionalists brought forward are convincing that you would have had to have a parliamentary justification for two reasons. The one is the Constitutional Court of Germany has said essential questions must be decided by the parliament, and letting in more than 1 million of persons seems quite obvious, an essential question, even if it's not easy to define what essential means. Second point is, of course, that it has enormous budgetary consequences, and the power of the purse is a parliamentary and not an executive province. For these two reasons, I had strong doubts with regard to the constitutionality of the procedure. And at the same time, of course, some of the arguments that were used against Merkel were themselves anti-constitutional, such as the argument we cannot let in Muslims. This is absurd. Our constitution does not discriminate on religion. The only argument could be that we cannot let in people if they are dangerous because of certain ideologies that may or may not be correlated with religious beliefs. Otherwise, it's absurd. And the fourth problem, and here I come to an end because my time is running out, is that in many aspects, Merkel was naive in believing that the other European states would follow suit. She was naive. She would have had to deal with them beforehand. I mean, I'm not a great admirer of the actual American president, but there are certain rules of deal-making, and a rule of deal-making is you first offer something conditionally before you let people in and then say, now you have to share with me. And it would have been wiser if she had said, we have to address this issue, we are willing to take in lion's part, but only if you do a part too. The reason why this didn't happen was, again, that she had to act under time pressure and there was no long strategy beforehand. Forgive me for having gone a little bit beyond my time due to my